Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 in Freshman English. You are in your hymnals now on page 210 to 11. We're going to work with the text American History by Judith Ortiz Cofer. However, before we get there, I'm with you on page 210 to 11 because I want to point out your textbook company and the authors of the anthology that you're studying from have decided they want to put together the two titles, Most Dangerous Game and American History. Now, we've already studied the text Most Dangerous Game, and what we'll do now is turn to American History. Before we get there, though, at level 2B, let's write it down now. You want to focus at level 2B, as it says on page 211, with the literary analysis topic of conflict. Now, of course, conflict for us, again, part of that rising action, as we've talked about it in our plot hill information. Conflict is usually reduced down to two different types. Internal conflict, where a character is struggling against himself, herself, itself. And then external conflict, where a character is either struggling against another character. We immediately think, of course, of Rainsford and Zeroff in Most Dangerous Game. Character versus nature, or character versus society, or even an idea of society. So as we turn then, we want to pay attention to these two different kinds of internal-external conflict. We also want to pay attention to the resolution. And do you see the word on page 211? This is huge for our study. The word epiphany. Now, if you followed any of my other lectures on LearnStrong.net when I talk about James Joyce, you know that I love to talk about this word epiphany because James Joyce liked to talk about this word epiphany. Let's define it one more time because it's central to our study of American history. An epiphany is a text that, or a situation where someone comes to an understanding through an event that is life-changing. In other words, epistemologically, the way you think about knowledge is somehow changed forever because of an epiphany. You learn something and it forever changes the way you think about the world or about yourself. Let's write this one down. When we study American history, we want the text. We want to make sure that we're paying attention to this question. What is the epiphany of this text? Okay? And again, to go back to other lectures we've already given. When we are working at level 2B, again, this is hypercritical. We always ask two questions. What is it and how does it work? So in other words, at the conclusion of our story, it's not enough to just simply know, oh, this kid has an epiphany in this story. No. More importantly, how does it work? In other words, the epiphany that this young person has, how does it in the story lead us to have a better understanding at 2A, for example, of themes, messages, things like that? All right, we're now with you on page 238. We're going to introduce the story, the Judith Ortiz Cofer story, American History. A very, very important story, and we could point out, this is a pretty controversial story. I've had freshmen that say of the text we've read in our freshman year, that American History story is maybe one of the more controversial ones. Why? We'll get to. On page 238, the big question we want to pay attention to is conflict necessary when we live in this world? The vocabulary information, make sure you know those words and feel comfortable with them. Let's meet Judith Ortiz Cofer. We'll start first of all with her birth date, 1952. She's still alive. Cofer spent, I'm reading now with you on 239, Cofer spent her childhood in two different cultures. By the way, let's point out the number of the authors that we've read who, like Cofer, have spent time in more than one culture. So significant in our study that we are able to recognize that there's multiple views dependent upon the culture one comes from, the language or languages that one has been raised with. And here, notice, coming from two different cultures. Born in Puerto Rico, she moved with her parents to Paterson, New Jersey when she was 4 years old, uprooted at 4. We want to write that down. She grew up mostly in Paterson, but she also spent time in Puerto Rico with her grandmother, right? It was from her grandmother that Ortiz Cofer learned the art of storytelling. Quote, she says, when my Abdullah set us down to tell a story, she says, we learned something from it, even though we always laughed. That was her way of teaching. In her own work, Cofer teaches readers about the richness and the difficulty of coming to age in two cultures at once. I would write that down because we're going to see this in this text itself. The difficulty of coming to age during that time period that Erickson and other important educational psychologists called adolescence. That time period when you're kind of coming of age And you're trying to do that in two different cultures, and the tension involved in that is going to be important in our story. By the way, she also teaches for Operation Homecoming, a writing program for U.S. military personnel down at the bottom of 239. Now, background for this story is huge. We've already mentioned one time earlier with the diary entry of Lady Bird Johnson. We already mentioned this day, this famous day in American history when John F. Kennedy was assassinated. That is central to this story, so let's read. The Kennedy assassination. Put it in your notes again, just so it's there. November 22, 1963. President John F. Kennedy was shot and killed in Dallas, Texas, and the United States was plunged into mourning, sadness, right? Most people who lived through that time can still remember where they were when they heard the news. Kennedy's assassination and the nation's grief defined a generation. Key events in American history take place on that fateful day. Now we're going to ask two questions at the end of this reading. Write them down. One, notice it to be we're constantly focusing on titles. We're going to look at this title and we're going to ask about both words in this title. Why is American there? Why is history there? That will be significant at the conclusion of this text. Number two, we're going to pay attention to the conflict and ultimately the epiphany that will happen in this text. All right? We're going to follow a young person who is going to have an epiphany, come to some realization, and that's forever going to kind of alter her view of the world. So let's play the game now. Now we have Reader who will be reading with us. Again, I challenge you to conquer monkey mind and to read each word. Let this story unfold for you and see if you can try and come up with the answers to those questions. All right, here we go. American history.
History by Judith Ortiz Cofer.
I once read in a Ripley's Believe It or Not column that Paterson, New Jersey is the place where the straight and narrow streets intersect. The Puerto Rican tenement known as El Building was 1 block up from Straight. It was, in fact, the corner of Straight and Market, not at the corner, but the corner. At almost any hour of the day, El Building was like a monstrous jukebox blasting out salsas from open windows as the residents, mostly new immigrants just up from the island, tried to drown out whatever they were currently enduring with loud music. But the day President Kennedy was shot, there was a profound silence in El Building. Even the abusive tones of viragos, the cursing of the unemployed, and the screeching of small children had been somehow muted. President Kennedy was a saint to these people. In fact, soon his photograph would be hung alongside the Sacred Heart and over the Spiritist altars that many women kept in their apartments. He would become part of the hierarchy of martyrs they prayed to for favors that only one who had died for a cause would understand. On the day that President Kennedy was shot, my 9th grade class had been out in the fenced playground of public school number 13. We had been given free exercise time and had been ordered by our PE teacher, Mr. De Palma, to keep moving. That meant that the girls should jump rope and the boys toss basketballs through a hoop at the far end of the yard. He, in the meantime, would keep an eye on us from just inside the building. It was a cold gray day in Paterson, the kind that warns of early snow. I was miserable, since I had forgotten my gloves, and my knuckles were turning red and raw from the jump rope. I was also taking a lot of abuse from the black girls for not turning the rope hard and fast enough for them. "Hey, skinny bones, pump it, girl. Ain't you got no energy today?" Gail, the biggest of the black girls at the other end of the rope, yelled, "Didn't you eat your rice and beans and pork chops for breakfast today?" The other girls picked up the pork chops and made it into a refrain. "Pork chop, did you eat your pork chop?" They entered the double ropes in pairs and exited without tripping or missing a beat. I felt a burning on my cheeks, and then my glasses fogged up so I could not manage to coordinate the jump rope with Gail. The chill was doing to me what it always did, entering my bones, making me cry, humiliating me. I hated the city, especially in winter. I hated public school number 13. I hated my skinny, flat-chested body, and I envied the black girls who could jump rope so fast that their legs became a blur. They always seemed to be warm while I froze. There was only one source of beauty and light for me that school year, the only thing I had anticipated at the start of the semester. That was seeing Eugene. In August, Eugene and his family had moved into the only house on the block that had a yard and trees. I could see his place from my window in El Building. In fact, if I sat on the fire escape, I was literally suspended above Eugene's backyard. It was my favorite spot to read my library books in the summer. Until that August, the house had been occupied by an old Jewish couple. Over the years, I had become part of their family without their knowing it, of course. I had a view of their kitchen and their backyard, and though I could not hear what they said, I knew when they were arguing, when one of them was sick, and many other things. I knew all this by watching them at mealtimes. I could see their kitchen table, the sink, and the stove. During good times, he sat at the table and read his newspapers while she fixed the meals. If they argued, he would leave and the old woman would sit and stare at nothing for a long time. When one of them was sick, the other would come and get things from the kitchen and carry them out on a tray. The old man had died in June. The last week of school, I had not seen him at the table at all. Then one day, I saw that there was a crowd in the kitchen. The old woman had finally emerged from the house on the arm of a stocky middle-aged woman, whom I had seen there a few times before, maybe her daughter. Then a man had carried out suitcases. The house had stood empty for weeks. I had had to resist the temptation to climb down into the yard and water the flowers the old lady had taken such good care of. In the next 30 minutes, I changed clothes, put on a little pink lipstick, and got my books together. Then I went in to tell my mother that I was going to a friend's house to study. By the time Eugene's family moved in, the yard was a tangled mass of weeds the father had spent several days mowing. And when he finished, from where I sat, I didn't see the red, yellow, and purple clusters that meant flowers to me. I didn't see this family sit down at the kitchen table together. It was just the mother, a red-headed tall woman who wore a white uniform, a nurse's, I guess it was. The father was gone before I got up in the morning and was never there at dinner time. I only saw him on weekends when they sometimes sat on lawn chairs under the oak tree, each hidden behind a section of the newspaper. And there was Eugene. He was tall and blond and he wore glasses. I liked him right away because he sat at the kitchen table and read books for hours. That summer, before we had even spoken one word to each other, I kept him company on my fire escape. Once school started, I looked for him in all my classes. But PS 13 was a huge, overpopulated place, and it took me days and many discreet questions to discover that Eugene was in honors classes for all his subjects, classes that were not open to me because English was not my first language, though I was a straight-A student. After much maneuvering, I managed to run into him in the hallway where his locker was on the other side of the building from mine, and in study hall at the library where he first seemed to notice me but did not speak, and finally on the way home after school one day when I decided to approach him directly, though my stomach was doing somersaults. I was ready for rejection, snobbery, the worst. But when I came up to him, practically panting in my nervousness, and blurted out, "You're Eugene, right?" He smiled, pushed up his glasses on his nose, and nodded. I saw then that he was blushing deeply. Eugene liked me, but he was shy. I did most of the talking that day. He nodded and smiled a lot. In the weeks that followed, we walked home together. He would linger at the corner of El Building for a few minutes, then walk down to his 2-story house. It was not until Eugene moved into that house that I noticed that El Building blocked most of the sun, and that the only spot that got a little sunlight during the day was the tiny square of earth that the old woman had planted with flowers. I did not tell Eugene that I could see inside his kitchen from my bedroom. I felt dishonest, But I liked my secret sharing of his evenings, especially now that I knew that he was reading, since we chose our books together at the school library. One day my mother came into my room as I was sitting on the windowsill staring out. In her abrupt way, she said, "Elena, you're acting moony." Enamorada was what she really said, that is, like a girl stupidly infatuated. Since I had turned 14, my mother had been more vigilant than ever. She acted as if I was going to go crazy or explode or something if she didn't watch me and nag me all the time about being a señorita now. She kept talking about virtue, morality, and other subjects that did not interest me in the least. My mother was unhappy in Patterson, but my father had a good job at the blue jeans factory in Passaic, and soon he kept assuring us we would be moving to our own house there. Every Sunday we drove out to the suburbs of Patterson, Clifton, and Passaic, out to where people mowed grass on Sundays in the summer, and where children made snowmen in the winter from pure white snow, not like the gray slush of Patterson which seemed to fall from the sky in that hue. I had learned to listen to my parents' dreams, which were spoken in Spanish, as fairy tales, like the stories about life in the island paradise of Puerto Rico before I was born. I had been to the island once as a little girl, to a grandmother's funeral, and all I remember was wailing women in black, my mother becoming hysterical and being given a pill that made her sleep 2 days, and me feeling lost in a crowd of strangers, all claiming to be my aunts, uncles, and cousins. I had actually been glad to return to the city. We had not been back there since then, though my parents talked constantly about buying a house on the beach someday, retiring on the island. That was a common topic among the residents of El Building. As for me, I was going to go to college and become a teacher. But after meeting Eugene, I began to think of the present more than of the future. What I wanted now was to enter that house I had watched for so many years. I wanted to see the other rooms where the old people had lived and where the boy spent his time. Most of all, I wanted to sit at the kitchen table with Eugene like two adults, like the old man and his wife had done. Maybe drink some coffee and talk about books. I had started reading Gone with the Wind. I was enthralled by it, with the daring and the passion of the beautiful girl living in a mansion, and with her devoted parents and the slaves who did everything for them. I didn't believe such a world had ever really existed, and I wanted to ask Eugene some questions, since he and his parents, he had told me, came up from Georgia, the same place where the novel was set. His father worked for a company that had transferred him to Patterson. His mother was very unhappy, Eugene said, in his beautiful voice that rose and fell over words in a strange lilting way. The kids at school called him the hick and made fun of the way he talked. I knew I was his only friend so far, and I liked that, though I felt sad for him sometimes. Skinny Bones and the hick was what they called us at school when we were seen together. The day Mr. De Palma came out into the cold and asked us to line up in front of him was the day that President Kennedy was shot. Mr. De Palma, a short, muscular man with slicked down black hair, was the science teacher, PE coach, and disciplinarian at PS 13. He was the teacher to whose homeroom you got assigned if you were a troublemaker, and the man called out to break up playground fights and to escort violently angry teenagers to the office. And Mr. De Palma was the man who called your parents in for a conference. That day, he stood in front of 2 rows of mostly black and Puerto Rican kids, brittle from their efforts to keep moving on a November day that was turning bitter cold. Mr. De Palma, to our complete shock, was crying. Not just silent adult tears, but really sobbing. There were a few titters from the back of the line where I stood shivering. "Listen!" Mr. De Palma raised his arms over his head as if he were about to conduct an orchestra. His voice broke and he covered his face with his hands. His barrel chest was heaving. Someone giggled behind me. "Listen," he repeated. "Something awful has happened." A strange gurgling came from his throat and he turned around and spat on the cement behind him. "Gross," someone said, and there was a lot of laughter. "The president is dead, you idiots." I should have known that wouldn't mean anything to a bunch of losers like you kids. Go home. He was shrieking now. No one moved for a minute or two, but then a big girl let out a "Yay!" and ran to get her books piled up with the others against the brick wall of the school building. The others followed in a mad scramble to get to their things before somebody caught on. It was still an hour to the dismissal bell. A little scared, I headed for L Building. There was an eerie feeling on the streets. I looked into Mario's drugstore, a favorite hangout for the high school crowd, but there were only a couple of old Jewish men at the soda bar talking with the short order cook in tones that sounded almost angry. But they were keeping their voices low. Even the traffic on one of the busiest intersections in Patterson, Straight Street and Park Avenue, seemed to be moving slower. There were no horns blasting that day. At L Building, the usual little group of unemployed men were not hanging out on the front stoop, making it difficult for women to enter the front door. No music spilled out from the open doors in the hallway. When I walked into our apartment, I found my mother sitting in front of the grainy picture of the television set. She looked up at me with a tear-streaked face and just said, "Dios mío," turning back to the set as if it were pulling at her eyes. I went into my room. Though I wanted to feel the right thing about President Kennedy's death, I could not fight the feeling of elation that stirred in my chest. Today was the day I was to visit Eugene in his house. He had asked me to come over after school to study for an American history test with him. We had also planned to walk to the public library together. I looked down into his yard. The oak tree was bare of leaves and the ground looked gray with ice. The light through the large kitchen window of his house told me that El Building blocked the sun to such an extent that they had to turn lights on in the middle of the day. I felt ashamed about it, but the white kitchen table with the lamp hanging just above it looked cozy and inviting. I would soon sit there across from Eugene, and I would tell him about my perch just above his house. Maybe I